Shalom to everyone who has come to this video. As it says here in 1 Timothy chapter 6, starting at verse 20, it says, O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science, falsely so called, which some professing, so what are they professing? They're professing this falsely so-called science. It says, which some professing have erred concerning the faith. Grace be with thee. Amen. So this false science is simply the false knowledge of man, or what men in a particular time may think that they know. The Greek word being used there that's translated as science is the Greek word gnosis, or gnosis, which also means knowledge. If you know anything about science, then you know that what is widely accepted to be truth, according to science, varies depending on what epoch you live in, as well as your geographical location. So the ideologies and philosophies that are accepted to be true in the mainstream scientific community right now will be different in 100 years. So what's true now will be considered false in 100 years. Therefore, one cannot depend on scientists for absolute and infallible truth. The only one who has infallible truth is the Creator, who is the source of life and knowledge, and who revealed himself to and through his creation, as is detailed in what we call the Holy Scriptures. Any so-called science or knowledge that is incongruent with thus saith the Most High is therefore false knowledge. This is Psalm chapter 14, verse 1. It says, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. So that describes atheists. When someone says in their heart, meaning their mind, that there is no Elohim, they are a fool, regardless of how much formal education they may have, regardless of how many degrees they may have. And it goes on further to say they are corrupt, they have done abominable works. There is none that doeth good. And that's our explanation for why they say that there is no God. Keeping in mind what we just read, that the fool hath said in his heart, which means his mind, that there is no God, and that they are corrupt, and that they have done abominable works. Here is an article about one of the individuals who may be considered the most prominent atheists in the world, Richard Dawkins. The article says, Richard Dawkins defends mild pedophilia again and again. And it says, Richard Dawkins defended mild pedophilia in an interview this weekend. It's not the first time. So we're just going to read a little bit of this. It says, Richard Dawkins defended mild pedophilia in an interview this weekend. And while the quote itself is quite jarring, especially to those who look to Dawkins for his influential writings on atheism, but haven't noticed some of his other strange stances, it's far from the first time that the scientist has launched a defense of the behavior or talked about his own abuse at the hands of boarding school teachers. First, here's what Dawkins said to the Times magazine as condensed by the Religion News Service. It says, referring to his early days at a boarding school in Salisbury, he recalled how one of the unnamed masters pulled me on his knee and put his hand inside my shorts. He said other children in his school peer group had been molested by the same teacher, but concluded, I don't think he did any of us lasting harm. Well, are you sure he didn't do you any lasting harm? Because you purport that there is no God. So I submit to you that he might have done you lasting harm. But continuing on, it says, I am very conscious that you can't condemn people of an earlier era by the standards of ours, just as we don't look back at the 18th and 19th centuries and condemn people for racism in the same way as we would condemn a modern person for racism. Well, speak for yourself, Richard Dawkins, because you're not speaking for me. It says, I look back a few decades to my childhood and see things like caning. And for those who don't know, caning is disciplining children in schools. That's what he's referring to. He says, like mild pedophilia, and can't find it in me to condemn it by the same standards as I or anyone would today, he said. So in other words, a little mild pedophilia was no big deal, and I can't judge them or condemn them like I would nowadays, or like people would nowadays. It's just a little mild pedophilia. It's not that big of a deal. He says, or it says rather, he said the most notorious cases of pedophilia involve rape and even murder and should not be bracketed with what he called just mild touching up. So just a little mild pedophilia, just a little mild touching up. That's all that is. And there are other articles that go into more details about his comments on these subjects. But I would say that we could surmise from his stance on the topic that Richard Dawkins probably himself is a pedophile. And again, as we already read in Psalm chapter 14, the fool says in his heart that there is no God, and they are corrupt, and they have done abominable works. And I would say that Richard Dawkins fits that profile. And again, this is one of the most prominent atheist scholars in the world. Now, some may say that what I'm doing is I'm presenting an ad hominem attack on Richard Dawkins, which is to say that I'm attacking Dawkins personally rather than attacking his information as an evolutionary biologist. And I would say that that is partially true, but that the observation that I just made is also a scriptural one. But we're also going to look at some of the so-called scientific arguments that are made by Dawkins and others in the atheist community. As you see here on the screen, it says humans and other great apes. For those who don't know, the following classifications have changed over the course of time, and in all likelihood will continue to do so. Because as I already stated at the onset of this video, science, so-called, is always changing. But according to modern taxonomy, humans, monkeys, apes are all primates. Monkeys have tails while apes do not. As you see on the screen here, it says humans are classified in the subgroup of primates known as the great apes. Humans are primates and are classified along with all other apes in a primate subgroup known as the hominoids. This ape group can be further subdivided into the great apes and lesser apes. Humans have bodies that are genetically and structurally very similar to those of the great apes. And so we are classified in the great apes subgroup, which is also known as the hominids. So as you just read, humans are classified amongst, or are considered to be, great apes. Now, to be clear, although the theory of evolution as a whole is false, certain aspects of so-called microevolution, as it has been labeled, are factual and are observable. For example, it is a fact that genes can and do mutate, and that's called a part of microevolution. However, it is false, for example, that humans and chimps both evolved into what we are today from a common ancestor, as we are told by the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution, as it is propounded today, is not demonstrable because of the absence of what's called the missing link, which in the case of humans and chimps, for example, will be a creature that possesses the in-between evolutionary properties of humans and our common ancestor that we supposedly share with chimps, showing a clear connection between humans and chimps. Paleontologists prefer nowadays to use the term transitional form or intermediate form or intermediate link. They prefer to use those terms instead of the term missing link. In other words, since they're telling us that humans and chimps, humans and monkeys, both evolved through the process of time from the same ancestor, then they should be able to show us some fossils, some proof of some creatures that were in between human and our supposed common ancestor that we have and that we share with chimps. But they can't do that. They have no proof, they have no fossils of any creatures that are in between humans and the supposed ancestor that we share with the chimpanzees. In his book On the Origin of Species, the celebrated English geologist and biologist who is credited with popularizing the theory of evolution named Charles Darwin noted that his theory of evolution did not have the appropriate fossil evidence needed to prove it. Therefore, he and others clung to the hope that throughout the process of time, the fossil record would show the intermediate forms, the intermediate fossils, the missing links necessary to support his theory. However, today, with more than 100,000 species being represented in fossils, and with more fossil evidence than ever before, the lack of these intermediate forms, the lack of these missing links, the lack of these transitional forms is even greater than it was when Darwin was alive. Meaning there's even less of a chance now, according to science, according to the fossil record, according to geology, that his theories were true. There is no missing link to prove Darwinism. Therefore, modern scientists don't even look for a missing link anymore per se, and instead have shifted their focus and their language to seeking to identify the most recent common ancestor, which in this case would be the most recent creatures from which humans and other apes are purportedly descended. In his book On the Origin of Species, Darwin said the following, as you see on the screen. It says, "Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links?" In other words, how come the fossils don't have these intermediate links? He's asking the question. And instead of intermediate links, you could say missing link. He says, geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this, perhaps, is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. So, just to be clear, when he refers to geology, he's referring to fossils. That's what he's referring to when he says geological formation and when he refers to geology. In this case, we're talking about fossils. And as you see here, Darwin's statement acknowledges that the largest hole in his theory is the fact that there is no intermediate form. Or as he put it, there are intermediate links, or we could say missing links, to demonstrate that his theory of evolution is reality. His explanation for this is, as it says here, the extreme imperfection of the geological record. In other words, he's saying that the records are incomplete, that they haven't found enough fossils, and that's the reason why you don't see these intermediate links. So just for the sake of clarity, I want to make sure that you understand here that Darwin is admitting in the second sentence that you see on the screen that geology does not reveal these so-called intermediate links. And he also says that, quote, perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. So he knows that what he's propounding is a theory, and he knows that the gravest and most obvious objection to it is the fact that he doesn't have these intermediate links. There's no proof that we evolved from a common ancestor that chimps and monkeys and baboons and orangutans evolved from. There's no proof of that. There are no fossils showing that. It's a theory. And I also want to make clear that in the last sentence, he says the explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. So his explanation is because we haven't found the fossils. But the reality is that Darwin has been dead for over 120 years. And paleontologists as well as archaeologists have been uncovering all sorts of things and still have not found these intermediate links, even though they have the motive to do so, because it will help to validate the dominant scientific theory that most scientists believe in. And what is that theory? It's evolution. And this Darwinism, this theory of evolution, has been so pervasive and influential on the minds of those who follow this theory that there have been attempts to hoax and to beguile the public into believing that these missing links have been found. As you see on the screen here, it says study reveals culprit behind Piltdown Man, one of science's most famous hoaxes. And we're just going to read a little bit of this. It says, the big-brained, ape-jawed Piltdown Man was hailed as a major missing link in human evolution when he was discovered in a gravel pit outside a small UK village in 1912. The find set the pace for evolutionary research for decades and established the United Kingdom as an important site in human evolution. The only problem? Piltdown Man turned out to be one of the most famous frauds in scientific history. A human cranium paired with an orangutan's jaw and teeth. Now, scientists think they figured out once and for all that a single hoaxer was responsible, not a duplicitous cabal. So for those who don't know, Piltdown Man was a skull presented as an authentic discovery by Charles Dawson that consisted of, as you see here, a human skull with an orangutan's jaw and teeth. It served as ostensibly a missing link between modern man and our common ancestor that we have with other so-called apes. And this fraud, this hoax, this missing link was accepted as factual. It was accepted as truth for over 40 years within the scientific community. Over 40 years, it was accepted as the truth. So that's another example of what I told you. Science changes its opinions over time. Again, as I stated, the scientific community wants evolution to be proven true. As it says here, is it a bird? Is it a dinosaur? No, it's a fake. It was a coupe for National Geographic, the first pictures of a creature whose existence would turn the theory of bird evolution on its head. Then it was exposed as a hoax. Julian Borger on the missing link that never was. So again, they're looking for that missing link, which doesn't exist. They want to prove that evolution is true. It says, Archaeoraptor first turned up in a hotel room in Tucson, Arizona. Stephen Circus, a dinosaur enthusiast who ran a small private museum, was wandering around a fossil fair when he heard that a Chinese dealer had something extraordinary. When the dealer unwrapped a foot-long slab of rock, Circus experienced a paleontological epiphany. Embedded in the stone were the fossilized bones of an extraordinary prehistoric animal, with the complex limbs of a prototype bird and the distinctive tail of an earthbound dromaeosaur, edged with the shadow of what seemed to be feathers. It looked like a dinosaur that could fly. It was stunning, Circus recalls. I could see right away that it didn't belong on sale. It belonged in a museum. It says he hastily contacted a patron who put up the $80,000 the dealer was asking for and took his prize home in a state of high excitement, convinced he had discovered evidence of a pivotal moment in evolution. That was last February. In the years since then, the dramatic rise and fall of Zerka's new bird dinosaur has been one of the strangest episodes in modern paleontology, and a scandal from which the science is still recovering. It says, after months of scrutiny involving x-rays and scans, Circus bird dinosaur was proclaimed a new species. So you see, they said, we've got a new species here. They said we've got a missing link here. Archaeoraptor leonensis by none other than the prestigious National Geographic journal. So National Geographic proclaimed that this Archaeoraptor leonensis was a real species that they had discovered. Again, I told you, science wants this to be real. It says the magazine heralded the find as a crucial missing link, representing conclusive proof that birds were the last living descendants of the dinosaurs. So they want to show you proof, conclusive proof, that evolution is real, that a creature can evolve from one creature to a totally different species throughout the process of time. Just like they tell you that monkeys and humans both evolved from the same ancestor. It says, but weeks later, Archaeoraptor was unveiled as a hoax wedged together with bits and pieces from at least two animals by canny Chinese farmers with a feel for what paleontologists were looking for. It now appears to have been the dinosaur version of Piltdown Man, the notorious fossil hoax put together in 1911 to provide the missing link between man and ape predicted by Charles Darwin. You see that? That's what they're looking for. They're looking for a missing link, but it doesn't exist. The famous British philosopher Antony Flew, who was considered to be one of the leading atheist thinkers of his time, recanted his atheism in his old age before he died. So although he had many fellow atheists who followed him and his teachings, before he died, again in his old age, he openly admitted that he no longer believed that atheism was true, and he converted to deism. As it says here on the screen, it says at the most recent debate in 2004 at New York University, he declared that he now accepted the existence of a God. In that debate, he said that he believed that the origin of life points to a creative intelligence. Almost entirely because of the DNA investigations, what I think the DNA material has done is that it has shown by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinarily diverse elements to work together. It's the enormous complexity of the number of elements and the enormous subtlety of the ways they work together. The meeting of these two parts at the right time by chance is simply minute. It is all a matter of the enormous complexity by which the results were achieved, which looked to me like the work of intelligence. In other words, what Antony Flew is saying, which is the same thing that I'm saying, is that just by looking at nature, just by looking at the way DNA operates, just by looking at things like, for example, the fact that there are more than 1 million cells in your eyeball alone that are working together. This shows, this demonstrates, this is evidence that there has to be a creator. There has to be a so-called God. Because the likelihood of all of these different elements, all of this complexity coming together by random chance is so small that it is in the realm of impossibility. But reading on here, it says, Flew was particularly impressed with a physician's refutation of the idea that monkeys at typewriters would eventually produce a Shakespearean sonnet. The likelihood of getting one Shakespearean sonnet by chance is 1 in 10 to the 690th power. To put this number in perspective, there are only 10 to the 80th power particles in the universe. And what they're saying is that there are only 10 to the 80th power particles, according to science, modern science, roughly in the known universe. And it says, Flew concludes, if the theorem won't work for a single sonnet, then of course it's simply absurd to suggest that the more elaborate feat of the origin of life could have been achieved by chance. In other words, if you can't say that it's likely or that it's in the realm of real possibility that a monkey at a typewriter would eventually produce a Shakespearean sonnet, if you can't say that, then of course you can't say that by random chance life would exist in the way that we know it, with all of its various complexities. It says Flew was also critical of Dawkins' selfish gene idea. So he's critical of Richard Dawkins. It says, pointing out that natural selection does not positively produce anything. And natural selection, for those who don't know, is the theory that was propounded by Charles Darwin as a part of his evolution theory. It says it only eliminates or tends to eliminate whatever is not competitive. He called Dawkins' The Selfish Gene a major exercise in popular mystification and argued that Dawkins made the critical mistake of overlooking the fact that most observable traits in organisms are the result of the coding of many genes. Now, although Antony Flew did not convert to the way, which very few people do, because you have to be of the elect to actually come to the way. The Most High has to call you. What he converted to before he died was common sense. As it says here in Romans chapter 1, verse 18, and by the way, although he was considered to be a highly intelligent man, sometimes those who are considered intellectually bright might not be wise. But as it says here, it says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and the unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen. And that's what Antony Flew had to admit before he died. He decided to go ahead and stop being stubborn and to admit the truth, that he can clearly see the invisible things of the Most High, because he sees the creation all around him. It's painfully obvious. It says, being understood by the things that are made. So by the things that are made, by creation, by life, by reproduction, by cells, by DNA, by germs, by animals, by plants, it is clearly shown that the Most High exists. Reading on, it says, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. It says here in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 19, the Lord by wisdom hath founded the earth, by understanding hath he established the heavens. By his knowledge the depths are broken up, and the clouds drop down the dew. So this is all due to the knowledge of the Creator, of the Most High. Although we do not depend on this as those of the faith, there are a plethora of archaeological artifacts that, even from a naturalistic perspective, demonstrate that much of the historical record as narrated in the scriptures is true. So again, we don't depend on this as those of the way. We know that the scriptures are true. But from a naturalistic perspective, from the perspective of someone who may be agnostic or atheistic, just from a historical perspective, there's much evidence. There's a plethora of evidence that shows that the narration that we read in the scriptures is historically accurate. For example, I'll touch on a few. As it says on the screen here, it says the Lachish reliefs are a set of Assyrian palace reliefs narrating the story of the Assyrian victory over the kingdom of Judah during the siege of Lachish in 701 BCE. It says carved between 700 and 681 BCE as a decoration of the southwest palace of Sennacherib in Nineveh, which is in modern day Iraq. The relief is today in the British Museum in London and was included as item 21 in the BBC Radio 4 series, A History of the World in 100 Objects by the museum's former director, Neil McGregor. So as I zoom in a little bit on these images, you can see these are the Israelites or the Judeans that were taken captive, and you can see their nappy heads. This is the actual relief. And as it says here in 2 Kings 18, verse 13, it says, now in the 14th year of Hezekiah, of King Hezekiah, did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. So again, we see the narration in the scriptures, the history given to us in the scriptures being validated by historical records. Again, it says King Sennacherib of Assyria came up against Judah. And whose relief is this? This is the relief of Sennacherib. Here's another example. As it says here, it says Jehoiakim's rations tablets. It says Jehoiakim's rations tablets date from the 6th century BC and describe the oil rations set aside for a royal captive identified with Jeconiah, or who we know as Jehoiakim, king of Yehuda. It says tablets from the royal archives of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, were unearthed in the ruins of Babylon that contain food rations paid to captives and craftsmen who lived in and around the city. On one of the tablets, it says Yaukinu, king of the land of Yahudu, is mentioned along with his 5 sons listed as royal princes. And we know that the scripture says that Nebuchadnezzar had Jehoiakim carried off to Babylon. In 2 Kings chapter 25, it says in verse 27, and it came to pass in the 37th year of the captivity of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 7th and 20th day of the month, that evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, did lift up the head of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, out of prison. And he spake kindly to him, and set his throne above the throne of the kings that were with him in Babylon, and changed his prison garments, and he did eat bread continually before him all the days of his life. And his allowance was a continual allowance given him of the king, a daily rate for every day, all the days of his life. So what is that referring to? That's referring to his rations, which Jehoiakim's rations tablets go into more detail about. Now, again, I'm going through this quickly because honestly, there are so many archaeological finds that corroborate the scriptures that I would be here for hours and hours if I were to go through each one in detail. On the screen here, it says 1896, W.M. Flinders Petrie discovered the Merneptah stele, also known as the Israel stele or victory stele of Merneptah, in the first court of Merneptah's mortuary temple at Thebes. It is inscribed on the reverse of a large granite stele, originally erected by the ancient Egyptian king Amenhotep III, but later inscribed by Merneptah, who ruled Egypt from 1213 to 1203 BC. The black granite stele primarily commemorates a victory in a campaign against the Libu and Meshwesh Libyans and their Sea People allies, but its final two lines refer to a prior military campaign in Canaan in which Merneptah states that he defeated Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanom, and Israel, among others. It is preserved in the Museum of Egyptian Antiquities in Cairo. There you have an ancient stele which mentions the name of the people of Israel, and when read in context, you will see that they lived in the same area that the scriptures say that they lived in. And why is that relevant? Because there are so-called scientists and archaeologists who claim that Israel as a people either never existed or that they didn't exist in that land at the time that the scripture says that they did. It says the Tel Dan stele was a black basalt stele erected by an Aramean king in northernmost Israel, containing an Aramaic inscription to commemorate his victory over the ancient Hebrews. Fragments of the stele, which has been dated to the 9th or 8th century BCE, were discovered at Tel Dan in 1993 and 94. Although the name of the author does not appear on the existing fragments, he is probably Hazael, a king of neighboring Aram Damascus. The stele affirms that during a time of war between Israel and Syria, the god Hadad had made the author king and given him victory. In the process, he had killed King Joram of Israel and his ally, King Ahaziah of the house of David. So here you have another archaeological find, which is corroborating the fact that King Joram existed, King Ahaziah, and it also mentions the house of David. Now, the author, who, as it says here, is probably Hazael, is taking credit for the killing of Joram and King Ahaziah. And we know that the scripture says Jehu killed these two individuals. However, this stele even mentions Jehu. So it's not far-fetched at all to believe that Hazael would take credit for what Jehu did. But it says, reading on, in the Bible, Hazael came to the throne after being appointed by the Israelite prophet Elisha to overthrow his predecessor, Ben-Hadad II. However, the Bible attributes the killing of Joram and Ahaziah to the action of the Israelite usurper Jehu, likewise at the behest of the prophet Elisha. The Bible confirms that Jehu later lost considerable amounts of northern territory to Hazael, as Dan lay just inside Israel's territory between Damascus and Jehu's capital of Samaria. This makes Hazael's erecting a victory monument at Dan highly plausible. The inscription has generated great interest because of its apparent reference to the house of David, constituting the earliest known confirmation outside of the Bible of the Davidic dynasty. Now, just for one more, because again, I could be here all day. It says on the screen, the Mesha stele, also known as the Moabite stone, And by the way, King Mesha of Moab is mentioned in 2 Kings. It says is a black basalt monument bearing an inscription by the 9th century BCE Moabite King Mesha, discovered in 1868 at Dibon, Jordan. The inscription of 34 lines is the most extensive document ever recovered referring contemporaneously to ancient Israel. The stele was erected by Mesha circa 850 BCE as a memorial of his victories, especially his revolt against the kingdom of Israel, apparently undertaken after the death of Israel's king Ahab. Currently displayed at the Louvre Museum in Paris, it is 124 centimeters high and 71 centimeters wide and deep, and rounded at the top. The monument was discovered in August 1868 by Reverend F.A. Klein, a German missionary to Jerusalem. It says in the final paragraph on the screen, the inscription is remarkable, not only for its confirmation of several biblical events and personalities, but also in that it provides important insights into the religion of Israel's neighbor, Moab, and the existence of a previously unknown Israelite shrine in Moabite territory. It also contains the earliest known reference to the Hebrew God Yahweh as the national God of Israel. I'll stop here and I'll talk about some of these things in another video. Shalom.